Good morning. Welcome to the talk on the question, was Marx a climate warrior? Now the answer to that question is in fact quite simple. No, he wasn't, for the simple reason that the problem of the climate change did not exist in the time. But there were other questions that concern the environment that did exist and about which there were discussions, and to which Marx did make some contributions, and I want to address one or two issues in that context. The big environmental issue of Marx's time was that of soil fertility in the context of the second agricultural revolution, which was more or less in parallel with the industrial revolution. The second agricultural revolution means or refers to the mechanization of agriculture, better transport systems that allowed increased large scale of agricultural production, etc., in tandem with the industrial revolution. And also it involved the increased use of modern or more modern forms of fertilization, which took various forms. For example, people were collecting bones from battlefields and were putting them on the fields. That is basically a form of traditional fertilization of the soil. There was some extent of trying to bring excrements from the cities, where now under urbanization during the Industrial Revolution more and more people were living. And then other things like guano was shipped in from Peru, which is basically a form of bird shit, which was used for fertilization. It was brought in on huge ships that must have stunk absolutely infernally. And then from around 1840, when the development of organic chemistry really takes off, the chemical industry produces the first industrial style fertilizers, and this obviously creates problems of its own, but this was to address the problem of the decreasing fertility of the soil. And in this context, Marx formulated or coined a formulation which you find quite a lot in environmental theory literature, which is that of the metabolic rift, the rift between humanity and the environment, or rather a rift in the metabolism between humanity and nature. This is a formulation that occurs several times in Marx's main work, Das Kapital, in volume 3 and also in the first volume of Capital. Metabolism obviously is a concept from biochemistry, meaning roughly transformation, the transformation of certain substances that are kind of circulated or like, if you like, cycled or recycled in a certain form. Now in this charming illustration, which I fished from somewhere on the internet, you can see how the thinking was concerning the metabolism between humanity and nature in the context of more traditional forms of agriculture. So we grow stuff, we eat, we excrete, and the excrement as compost returns to the soil. So a large part of the substances that we consume are brought back onto the soil, and so this the fertility is reconstituted. The soil's fertility is reconstituted in a form of more or less everlasting cycle. That is sort of the traditional idea of this metabolism. Now with the metabolic rift, when this metabolic cycle is broken, the situation is rather that we grow stuff, we eat, we discard, but the excrement goes into the rivers, typically in the form of waste and pollution, which means on the other hand that the fields need to be fertilized in other forms, in particular through chemical fertilizer. So the reason for this rift is urbanization. Is quite simply that the excrements from all of us who live in the cities cannot be brought back to the fields, or Well, they could be probably, but they are not, because that would not be profitable. So in a context of capitalist agriculture, it is more profitable to use industrial fertilizers and to discard with the excrement. And then obviously at the next level, if you like, in the context of the world trade, the fields where our food is grown are not only on the countryside, whereas the majority of people live in cities, but they're in other countries, maybe in other continents, etc. So this rift deepens even further. That is the idea here. Here's a quotation from the first volume of Capital, where Marx describes his thinking on this particular environmental problem, or what we would call an environmental problem. So he writes, capitalist production collects the population together in great centers, urbanization, and causes the urban population to achieve an ever-growing preponderance over the population in the countryside. This disturbs the metabolic interaction between man and the earth. Man here obviously meaning human beings. That is, it prevents the return to the soil of its constituent elements consumed by humans in the form of food and clothing. Hence, it hinders the operation of the eternal natural condition for the lasting fertility of the soil. So this was probably the big environmental discussion at the time. All progress in capitalist agriculture is a progress in the art not only of robbing the worker, but of robbing the soil. All progress in increasing the fertility of the soil for a given time is a progress towards ruining the more long-lasting sources of that fertility. Right? So the fertilizer increases the fertility now, but actually is just sort of kicking the can down the road. That's the idea here. Capitalist production therefore only develops the techniques and the degree of combination of the social process of production by simultaneously undermining the original sources of all wealth, the soil and the worker. So this is a key idea in Marx's writing, that wealth in any type of society results from labor and nature, which is what we labor on. So these are the two sources of all wealth. Now the idea here is that the exploitation of the soil undermines what we would call sustainability. That's basically what the metabolic rift is addressing. Relatedly, as sort of further to keep in mind concerning urbanization, is that the reason that factories were moved from small towns in the countryside, from where they were in the very early stages of the Industrial Revolution, to cities has to do with labor markets. So in big cities it was capitalists were better able to find cheap labor rather than on the countryside, because the workers in these very small towns in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution had a relatively good bargaining position, because there weren't many of them. So it was welcome to move the factories from the countryside, where the factories typically were along rivers, because they depended on the energy from the water. They were transferred to the cities because coal, which could be transported, became the new principal source of energy for running these factories, and that allowed the exploitation of cheaper labor. So this is, I mentioned this only because it makes clear that this is not as such a question of technology. So the technology serves a particular need or a necessity that results from the social form of organization of the production, which is obviously that of capitalist wage labor. That is the reason why the source of energy, the rivers as the source of energy, were replaced by coal as that predominant source of energy. Now back to that quote, capitalist production only develops the social process of production by undermining the original sources of all wealth, the soil and the worker. Now this refers to the idea that there are two sources of wealth, labor, and obviously when you labor, you have to labor on something, and that something ultimately is nature. This is universally so. This would apply to any mode of production in any particular type of society. Whereas the really interesting questions all concern the social form of wealth and the production of wealth. And that is what is central to Marx's theorizing. So Marx's theorizing is much more a theorizing of the specific social form of wealth production rather than the production of wealth in general. That is basically just a sort of a background conception that is simply presupposed, and that is pretty much in agreement with how this is also discussed in classical political economy. So the specific character of Marx's discussion is always on the specific social form of wealth. So this distinction is hugely important, and it is basically a fundamental sociological distinction between wealth in a sort of general sense, or the concept of wealth in a very generic sense, and the specific form wealth and wealth production take in a particular type of society. And that's where it's really interesting. Now Marx makes two different contributions to environmentalism, if you like. One is pretty straightforward, that is the concept of the metabolic rift, which is basically the idea of sustainability. He also made comments on pollution, health, deforestation, etc., which were all things that were in the air, in more sense than one. The second contribution is much more difficult and theoretical, and it is to do with Marx's theory of the specific dynamism of the capitalist mode of production. The question why it is impossible for capitalism ever to stop expanding production. Capitalism always has to produce ever more and more and faster and faster. And that is obviously what is behind that graph you saw at the beginning of the presentation of the explosion of the consumption of energy, in particular in the period following World War II, which is of course the crux of the problem that we are now addressing in the form of climate change, the huge expansion of production. And that has to do with the social form side of the analysis of wealth production in capitalism. And this is slightly more complicated, and is actually probably not a good idea to try to explain this in 5 minutes, but I'll give it a go anyway. Because this is really the more important contribution that Marxist theory can make or has made to the development of environmental theory. Now, the social form of wealth in capitalist society is called value, which is expressed in money. Money is the form of appearance of value. Value is an expression of exchange value, which is the proportion in which commodities are exchanged against each other, which derives from the labor time that is needed in the societal average to produce something. So this is one of the ideas of 18th century classical political economy. People then were thinking about what is it actually that we do when we exchange certain quantities of different things, different commodities against each other, to the effect that we feel it's a fair exchange. And the only answer to that question was, well, it must have to do with the time it takes to produce these things. So if we exchange two completely different objects or commodities in particular quantities, then we feel good about doing this, or we feel it was okay or fair to have this exchange when we think that either side in this exchange spent roughly the same amount of time on producing the things that went into the exchange. That's sort of the origin of this idea, which is central to classical political economy. And this idea obviously is what Marx picks up and develops in his contribution. Now, capitalism is geared to maximize value in the form of profit, because it needs to increase productivity, which requires investments. Capitalism is a mode that is uniquely dynamic, a mode of production that is uniquely dynamic in the sense that it constantly revolutionizes the instruments and the mode of producing. As a capitalist, one is forced to keep up with the Joneses in terms of productivity, otherwise you go out of business. So this is here not a question of being greedy, etc. It is a systemic pressure that forces capitalists to increase productivity. And that is only possible if you develop your instruments of production on the basis of the profit that you make in the capitalist process. Now there is a fundamental contradiction in this system, and that is that capitalists must increase productivity, which is just another way of saying reduce the need for labor that is needed to produce a particular quantity of a commodity. But also on the other side, they must appropriate more labor overall, because that's what profit essentially is. That means that more and more wealth must be produced, because the individual commodities constitute less and less value, which at the level of everyday experience, which is our level of experience of this process, is reflected in the fact that they become cheaper. Right? This is something everybody knows. New products, new commodities are initially very expensive and then they become cheaper. Which means that to say that they are cheaper simply means that they constitute a lesser quantity of value. And the value is obviously what capitalists need to accumulate to make a profit, which they then can invest into their production process and increase productivity again and remain competitive with everybody else. Now, in order even just to reproduce capital at the same level, let alone at an expanded level, they must produce more and more wealth to produce in this hugely increased amount of things roughly the same or perhaps even a slightly larger amount of value. That is the problem that makes the life of a capitalist difficult. Now, on the one hand, this is a good thing, because producing more stuff means that we have more things, such as more food, more clothes, etc. Things that we need, or the things that at least we like to have. That's a good thing. That's why capitalism is a relatively popular system. But at the same time, it's a bad thing because it takes the form of a blind automatic process. We are forced, we as a society or as humanity, we are forced to have more and more stuff, which means, of course, we consume increasingly more resources, and that is the crux of the environmental problem. We cannot decide what exactly it is we want. And this, the blindness of the process, is due to the social form wealth and wealth production take in capitalist society. So we are dealing with an uncontrollable systemic dynamic, which also means, by the way, that we have to work more and more, although as humanity we could afford to work much less and let machines do a much larger part of the work for us. Which makes the image of the treadmill an apt symbol of capitalism. So you have to run faster and faster, but you're basically treading at the same place. Well, thank you very much for your attention. Here are some of the references which you, perhaps if you want to study this further, you might find useful. And I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.